Hello, folks. This is John Franzino. I'm the Vice President of Grid Security at Grid Subject Matter Experts. And today we're going to do one quick run through of the CIP-003-7 requirements for low impact facilities in preparation for the upcoming enforcement date of January 1st, 2020. With that said, CIP-3 version 8 is actually coming up quickly too next April in 2020. However, 99% of what I'm going to go over today is going to be applicable for version 8 as well. So don't worry, there's just some small changes ahead. It's really this big change in version 7 that I want to make sure everyone's on the same page and we all have the right evidence sets to be compliant at the turn of the new year. So before we jump in and review the low impact requirements, let's first make sure we understand how to determine the impact rating of our physical assets. And so that happens in CIP-2, the BES categorization process. So first we look at the inherent risk rating of a physical asset such as a control center, a transmission substation, or a solar generator. Typically based on the nameplate rating or other electrical characteristics of that facility, we will end up either determining based on the bright line criteria in CIP-2, which we'll review in a second, whether that asset is considered low, medium, or high impact. Then from there, we look at what cyber systems are associated with the operation and monitoring of that physical asset. And so if you determine that your physical asset meets the low impact criteria, you only need to formally identify what, if any, BES cyber systems are associated with that physical asset. You do not need to proceed to the final step in CIP-2, which is producing a discrete list of cyber assets. That is only explicitly required for medium and high impact facilities. However, with that said, both from a best practice standpoint and from what auditors have come out and released from preliminary guidance, is that we really should be producing those cyber asset lists for low impact facilities as well. It's not explicitly required, but the auditors have said in various regions that they will ask you for it if you have it at audit. And again, it is really one of the fundamental first steps of a strong cyber program. So we strongly recommend that all entities produce that cyber asset list, even if you determine you have a low impact facility. All right, so I mentioned the bright line criteria and making the determination between medium and low impact. From a solar and wind generator and control center standpoint, that magic number is 1,500 megawatts or MVAs. At the generator level, we have yet to see a generator that is greater than 1,500 MVA. So essentially, by default, if a generator meets the 75 MVA registration threshold for dispersed power resources, such as solar and wind and other inverter-based resources, it's going to be rated as a low-impact facility. Sub 75 MVA, unless roped in for other reasons, typically do not need to register with NERC, and therefore none of the CIP fund or any of the other NERC reliability standards apply. However, still think about what types of equivalent controls you want to put in place from a general business and operational risk management standpoint. At the control center level, the map shown here is the most important part, and that's how we have to go through and determine as a generator operator how many megawatts are we performing that generator operator function for. If that megawatt tally is greater than 1,500 in a single interconnection, and the interconnections here are divided. We have the western, the eastern, and the ERCOT interconnection. And also don't forget about our friends in Quebec. If that tallies to more than 1,500 megawatts, then you're looking at a medium impact control center. Otherwise, I have a low impact control center, and only the CIP-3 requirements that we're going to go over today apply. All right, so let's assume you determine you have low impact BES cyber systems. Now what? Well, go to CIP-3. We're currently on version 7, soon to be on version 8, but the same guidance applies. In attachment 1 of CIP-3 is where all the meat in terms of the requirements for low impact BES cyber systems are. So you can start there. Now, for those of you who just want to know what to do and not read through all of the half engineering, half legalese language, which is the NERC reliability standards, the answers to the test are essentially in attachment 2 or in other reliability standards covered in measures. So these basically tell you examples of evidence for what the auditors were really looking for each requirement. Now, the problem here is, again, it's not necessarily only always in plain English. We have a mix of lawyers and engineers writing these requirements. So while this is certainly a great place to start, and the RSAWs, which are used at audit, are another way to get the answers to the test, sometimes they're not very clear. So what we're going to do today is go over all of this in plain English, but just know that you have these resources available through NERC documentation as well. All right, so it starts with security awareness. And so essentially we have a requirement for low impact facilities to distribute security awareness at least once a CIP year, every 15 calendar months. The hardest question to answer for security awareness in low impact facilities is who actually needs to be aware, who needs to be on that list of that distribution list. Well, I would argue that everyone should be using role-based access management privileges here to determine that list. And what I mean by that is think about what roles in your company or contracted companies that you work with, either have physical, electronic, or remote access to any of your low impact facilities and the associated cyber systems. Those are the folks that need to be on the distribution list for your security awareness. If you have an access management program that you use to grant and revoke both electronic and physical access, obtaining that list should be super easy. However, if you don't have an access management program, maybe this is a good excuse to put one in place, or you're just going to have to go through and manually complete that effort by thinking about all those different vendors and folks associated with your facility and how to disseminate the security awareness materials to them. So you can distribute them in multitude of ways. For example, email works, PDF works. Some of the more advanced and better systems are called learning management systems, where this information is distributed in a trackable and a reinforceable way, where you actually have metrics on who completed the different training modules and the awareness and what their completion rate is. And so that's really looking at a more mature program. But just putting up posters and sending an email, once a year will suffice from a CIP low impact compliance perspective. So what does good awareness material look like? It has to be relevant, and that means relevant to your operating environment and your asset. There's lots of different cybersecurity principles and guidance out there, most of which will be relevant in all situations, but not everything. So take a look at the types of controls you have in place and the types of risks facing your environment, and make sure that the security awareness content you're creating, distributing addresses that. Make sure it's timely too. And so, things are changing quickly in the cyber industry. So, what was true 4 years ago may not be true anymore. A great example is the NIST password guidance. We used to be told by NIST that it was best to cycle your passwords at a regular interval, say 90 days or a year. But now new guidance has come out and said that the unintended consequences of that cycling, aka people writing their passwords on sticky notes, etc., is actually worse than just having the same password, one strong unique password, and then only changing it if you have indication that it may be compromised or leaked. So that's a good example of why we have to ensure that security awareness is timely, because if you're looking 4 years ago, you would have disseminated not the best and most accurate information regarding passwords to your employees and contractors. Last and not least, make sure it's tailored. This kind of goes back to the relevant. Just make sure it's tailored for your operating environment and that it's real. And so, for example, give security awareness that touches on your specific policies and procedural requirements for your environment, not always just in general practices. Moving on to physical security controls. So again, just cutting through the language of this in plain English, we need to know where low impact BES cyber systems are located, know who has a business and operational need to access those locations, and have the capability to grant and revoke access as those needs change. So that's essentially the only requirements. To support that, you definitely want to have a good physical security diagram as shown here on this slide, and where those key access points are. Just know that typically speaking, most of your BES cyber system will be in the control building. However, each inverter is also considered part of the BES cyber system, so you do need to consider perimeter fencing or some other security control around the array and have an ability to control access to and from. So again, while it's not said explicitly in the standard language, preliminary guidance from the auditors have already come out regarding what they will be looking for from a physical security standpoint. So they've come out and said that if you're going to use physical locks and keys, that's fine. Just be prepared to show your key management program. Because what happens with physical locks and keys is, Bob leaves and Bob never returns his key, and now he has a master key to all facilities for the next 30 years. So the auditors are going to be asking to see what types of controls, procedural or otherwise, do you have in place to reduce that risk of keys never being revoked and locks never being rekeyed as necessary. That's a headache. Everyone who's ever dealt with the physical key management program knows that that is not necessarily a fun and exciting task to deal with, and nor is it very effective in most situations. So one of the best ways to avoid the key management headache is electronic locks. However, in most distributed environments, such as solar and wind facilities, it's not really practical to get, your typical HID badge reader out to every access point. It's just too expensive, and getting that low voltage power to those doors is usually just not practical whatsoever. With that said, a third option and kind of a middle ground option is emerging, and that's in the form of smart padlocks. They're much cheaper, they don't require hardwired power to them, and they give you a lot of the same benefits of a full-fledged HID badge system in that they have tracking and auditing capabilities, and on-the-fly access revocation. So if one of your employees ever is terminated or leaves, much easier to electronically restrict their access and revoke their access than it would be with a physical key. Not to mention it provides you operational visibility from a safety standpoint about who's going in and out of your facility. All right, onto electronic access controls. This is arguably the most confusing point for most folks in the low impact realm. And so I just want to spend a second focusing on this diagram here that shows the control centers, the generator operators, ownership demarc points, and its SIP footprint compared to the facility level, the generator owner's SIP footprint and responsibilities. So at the control center, and this diagram only depicts a control center having a single connection with one remote facility, but obviously most GOP control centers have many connections with remote facilities, but the same concepts apply. Basically, what we're looking at here is how we use firewalls to stop what we call the SIP blob from spreading. So the firewalls act as your electronic access point and as the demarcation point between what is in scope for SIP and what is not. And this applies to both low impact, medium impact, and high impact BES cyber systems. So the important moral of the story here is that the generator operator has their own SIP footprint within their control center, and that's where all of their SIP compliance responsibilities start and end. Then as we communicate between the control center firewalls and the remote site firewalls over the backbone of the internet, there are no SIP requirements in play until those communications hit the remote site firewalls, at which point the generator owner's SIP footprint begins, and the SCADA system comprised of the inverters, HMI, etc. behind that are part of that low impact BES cyber system. So just because a generator operator has a SIP program in place at their control center doesn't mean that the site is taken care of. They have two distinct sets of responsibilities, and of course the generator operator through contractual agreements can help you meet your SIP responsibilities at these remote facilities on behalf of the generator owner, but just because they have a program in place at the control center level does not mean it magically trickles down to the site level. All right, so now let's actually talk about what the requirement is. And so the requirement for low impact BES cyber systems is to control and enforce all inbound and outbound communications. Typically this is done with a firewall, but there are other means to do this. We can only permit the required communications and traffic that is necessary for the operations of the facility. All other communications must be denied by default by that electronic access point. If you have any legacy dial-up systems, we have to show an authentication method for those dial-up systems. All right, so we're going to go through basically how do you just comply with the requirement, and then start talking about some more best practice things everyone needs to be thinking about for these $100 million plus assets out on the grid. So to just comply with the requirement, you need to do a network architecture evaluation to ensure you know and understand where all of your electronic access points in and out of your low impact BS cyber system are. Then, for all identified electronic access points, aka firewalls most of the time, we need to conduct a rule set evaluation and ensure that every rule that is permitting traffic in and out of the facility is operationally or justified. And you need to document those justifications. Then we need the full evidence set is a updated and complete network diagram depicting the logical network architecture and those electronic access points, supplemented by that trued up rule set that shows we are only allowing traffic in and out of the facility that's absolutely necessary for the operation of the facility. Everything else is denied by default. But there's still a little more to do if we actually want to look at how to make our firewalls secure, not just compliant. So for example, you could say that you have a telnet connection going in and out of your facility, and that's justified for remote, meter or breaker operation. So that's technically compliant and justified. However, telnet over the internet is insecure. So what we want to start to do to make our firewall secure is eliminate and block the use of outdated or insecure protocols whenever possible. We also want to make sure that we're authenticating folks at the firewall for remote access purposes prior to allowing them remote access into our actual low impact BES cyber system. Remote access is a great power and a great risk, so we have to ensure that it is appropriately controlled and monitored at each facility, because it's arguably the greatest risk that each facility faces from a cybersecurity perspective. Last and certainly not least is thinking about implementing intrusion detection and monitoring. Most firewalls, as long as you have the right licensing, have this built into them, so it's not a huge technical lift or very complex to implement. And now let's turn our focus to the additional controls we need to be looking at, and that's things like network segmentation that's shown on this ICS CERT diagram, recommended architecture here, and just ensuring that your corporate and less secure, untrusted networks are logically segmented and maybe even physically segmented if possible from your control systems at the facility or at control centers. Network monitoring and event log monitoring is super important to know what's going on in these systems. If you just ask a lot of these systems, they will tell you a great wealth of information. We just have to aggregate those logs and have a way to analyze those logs, because they do tell you a lot of information. So it's the needle in the haystack game, but if you have the right system set up in place, log monitoring is super valuable and important to understanding what your cyber posture looks like at any given point in time. And to that point, continuous vulnerability management and patch management is another great cyber health metric, and understanding, especially for my internet-facing firewalls and other devices, what vulnerabilities, exploitable vulnerabilities, are present, and that needs to inform what my patching cycle is. We don't want to leave unpatched firewalls out there. We saw there was an event in March that due to unpatched Cisco ASA firewalls at 12 different low impact facilities and control center, they were continuously rebooted due to a very easy to exploit vulnerability that already had a patch out there from Cisco. So that was a near miss event that could be easily avoidable by just having a strong vulnerability and patch management program in place. So moving on to cybersecurity incident response, and that's where some of those controls I just mentioned, intrusion detection, log monitoring, vulnerability management, etc., become even more important, because those are great ways to actually help identify potential incidents, and that is one of the discrete requirements for CIP low impact facilities. The low impact requirements for cybersecurity incident response plans actually closely match what SANS guidance is for incident response, and SANS is one of the industry leaders from a cybersecurity training perspective, and they have a big ICS program. So we first need to make sure we have a plan in place. That's our preparation. Make sure we understand who is involved and how to communicate with each other should we have a potential or confirmed incident. Then we're looking at how do we actually identify an incident, and that goes back to those controls. We can't just rely on manual operator intervention these days. Attackers are not going in and necessarily being as disruptive and noisy as possible. They're actually going in and being silent and watching. So it's not just because your computer isn't running slow or crashing doesn't mean that there hasn't been an incident or a compromise already. So therefore, relying on the humans to identify these potential incidents is not enough, and we need other detective controls in place. Then we're looking at, okay, we have a potential incident, we have to contain, we have to mitigate the impact of this incident, and that's when, things like opening up phone bridges and getting your incident response team on the horn and working together quickly becomes so important. We move quickly into eradication after the incident has been contained, and then we start thinking about how to recover and get operations back to normal. Last and not least, we're looking at after the event is over and the dust has settled, we're going back and saying what worked well, what didn't, and conducting formal lessons learned with the whole team, and then updating our plan accordingly based on any lessons learned. So how do I actually need to identify potential cybersecurity incidents? I just touched on this, so I won't go over it again. But again, you can't rely on manual methods. You have to implement additional detective controls. In order to test your cybersecurity incident response plan, which is one of the requirements, you have to do that every 3 years for low impact facilities. You should also be testing it using a combination of tabletop and operational exercises. So the compliance requirement is to do one or the other. Tabletops are easier to conduct because you're just kind of running through example scenarios and talking through them and how you would your teams would communicate. Whereas an operational exercise actually mimics a true incident a little closer. You may actually take down a system in a planned fashion so that your cyber teams need to be able to respond without having access to some of their tools or visibility they would normally, or your operators lose remote connectivity to the site and actually cut off that connectivity. So as they're going through this exercise, it really feels like they're in an incident and really operating to what their incident response plan would be in real life. In terms of updating the plan, I mentioned we have formal lessons learned requirements. So after you can conduct a test or a real incident occurs within 180 days, you need to update your lessons learned and then update the CIP accordingly. All right, on to transient cyber assets and removable media. This arguably may be the most difficult to deal with requirement in low impact land, and that's really just because transient cyber assets and removable media are transient in nature, and they're numerous in nature, and they're much harder to control. We put a nice little perimeter around our low impact BS cyber systems with our firewalls, but now we have these laptops and thumb drives that can just completely bypass our perimeter protections and introduce malware or other nasty things into our BAS cyber system. So making sure we have a handle on this and reducing that risk is imperative. So there's so the requirement in plain English says that you need to manage and secure entity-owned transient cyber assets, or if you're going to allow third-party contractors to use their own laptops and other media, you need to be able to verify the security controls on those devices, even though you may not manage them. And then you need to be able to scan removable media for viruses prior to connecting them to any of your BES cyber systems. Two major flavors of TCAs, like I mentioned. There's the ones that the entity, the generator owner or the generator operator actually owns and manages in a continuous ongoing fashion. So maintaining patch updates, maintaining antivirus signature updates, and all of the other technical requirements. And then there's the third-party owned and managed TCAs that maybe you as the entity, the registered entity, don't have direct control over. And so, regardless of what the flavor is, but especially pertinent for the third-party owned and managed, you basically need to have a request process and approval process so that we can ensure the transient cyber asset gets appropriately scanned and vetted. Then that's part of the verification process, and then that second approval is really the technical approval once we get our scan results back. Are there any concerning issues with this device? If so, let's remediate those issues. If not, then we're going to allow that device to connect to our BS cyber system. And then basically we just package up the evidence of that request, approval, and verification process. So that was a very quick run through. I did my best to keep it short and sweet, but I'm sure there's probably follow-up questions from a SIP low impact perspective. Just note one thing I did not cover in any detail today was the SIP exceptional circumstance requirements in SIP 3-7. Those are relatively easy, but essentially, if any extenuating, force majeure situation arises, you have the opportunity to temporarily bypass the some of the security controls for transient cyber assets, removable media, as deemed necessary by your SIP senior manager and/or delegates. And that's important, that's really to support the overall reliability of the grid, not degrade it. So, those are really talking about extreme events, health related safety events, and other things like that. So don't use that as a way out to not do the requirements. That won't work. But just know that you do have that lever to pull if push ever comes to shove. And temporarily speaking, some of those controls need to be bypassed. Just know that that all needs to be documented, and you need to show what you did in the interim to reduce the risk of introducing malicious code into your BES cyber systems. Don't hesitate to reach out, contact me if anything was not clear, you have follow-up questions. Happy to help whenever I